I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Along with heart disease and cancer, people fear dementia. We always hear you can't prevent it. Is that really true? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
A link between herpes infections and Alzheimer disease was proposed at least 40 years ago. Since then, the evidence has grown, although mainstream medicine wasn't paying attention.
Today, we hear from a Swedish scientist about her research on the connection between herpes and Alzheimer disease.
We'll also learn how the rollout of the Zostavax shingles vaccine in Wales provided a quasi-randomized experiment. It demonstrated that the shingles vaccine offers significant protection from dementia.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, viruses, vaccines, and Alzheimer disease.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Food and Drug Administration has just made it a little easier to get screened for colon cancer. The gold standard for detecting colorectal cancer is a colonoscopy, repeated at periodic intervals. In addition to detecting cancer, this procedure allows a physician to remove any polyps, which are precancerous growths, that he might find. However, many people are reluctant to schedule colonoscopies. As a result, as many as a fourth or perhaps even a half of those who could benefit from screening don't get it. The new test is approved for adults 45 or older. It's based on DNA in blood. Both polyps and tumors shed some of their DNA, and this analysis detects it when the tumors are still small. In evaluating this test, called SHIELD, investigators found that it detected 87% of cancers at an early stage. Those are highly treatable. By contrast, colonoscopies find about 95% of these tumors. If the SHIELD blood test detects tumor DNA, the patient will need a follow-up colonoscopy. Medicare is expected to cover the cost. People paying out of pocket might have to pay as much as $900.
Statin-type cholesterol-lowering drugs are among the most popular medications in the pharmacy. At last count, nearly 30 million Americans are taking atorvastatin alone. Another 20 million are taking other statins, such as simvastatin, rosuvastatin, or pravastatin. But a new risk calculator proposed by the American Heart Association would reduce the number of people who would be encouraged to take a statin. The calculator is labeled PREVENT. If cardiologists adopt the PREVENT recommendations, 14 million people would no longer need to take statins. An analysis in JAMA pushes back. The authors suggest that adopting the PREVENT calculator could lead to more than 100,000 heart attacks over 10 years. Almost 5 million Americans would be prescribed moderate intensity rather than high-intensity statins. Over 2 million people would no longer need blood pressure medications under the PREVENT guidelines. The new controversy demonstrates that risk calculators and practice guidelines are subject to change.
Diagnosing Alzheimer disease has been challenging for decades. Physicians had to rely on autopsy data to determine if a person really had extensive plaques of beta amyloid or tangles of tau in their brain. Brain scans and analyses of cerebrospinal fluid have made it possible to identify this type of dementia before death, but these are not easy tests. Now, researchers report in JAMA that a blood test is more accurate than CT scans and more reliable than cognitive tests. The blood test identifies a form of tau that's linked to Alzheimer disease. In the study, the blood test identified people with Alzheimer disease 90% of the time. This could make early diagnosis more feasible.
Getting vaccinated against shingles also helps reduce the likelihood of developing dementia. That's the startling finding from a study published in Nature Medicine. In 2017, the United States switched from the first shingles vaccine, Zostavax, to an improved version called Shingrix. Shingrix is a recombinant vaccine that's more effective against shingles. According to the scientists, it's also better at preventing or delaying the development of dementia. For 6 years, they followed the medical progress of about 200,000 people at least 65 years of age. Zostavax itself modestly reduced the risk of dementia. As people shifted to getting Shingrix instead, the investigators noticed a 17% drop in dementia diagnoses. This is equivalent to 164 more days without dementia on average. Researchers have not yet determined the exact mechanism of this protective effect. The authors note that the recombinant vaccine is associated with a significantly lower risk of dementia in the 6 years post-vaccination, which is one of the most impressive results yet reported for an Alzheimer disease intervention. The FDA has recently approved 2 medications that remove amyloid plaques from the brain. They're far more expensive than a shingle shot and carry significant risks. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. According to the Alzheimer's Association, nearly 7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer disease. Worldwide, the number is over 55 million.
The toll on families as well as society is enormous. People lose their ability to work, drive, manage their finances, or even take care of themselves. Ultimately, they lose their ability to interact with loved ones. Nursing home care is expensive and getting harder to access.
When we think about what might cause Alzheimer's disease, most people don't think of infections. But there's increasing evidence that pathogens, like herpes viruses, may play an important role.
To learn more about this intriguing possibility, we turn to Dr. Bodil Vedun. She is an associated researcher at the Department of Public Health and Caring Sciences and also holds a post in clinical geriatrics at Uppsala University in Sweden. We talked to her by phone in her office there.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Bodil Vedun.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Vedun, in 1982, a pathologist by the name of Dr. Melvin Ball reported in the Canadian Journal of Neurological Sciences that the herpes simplex virus might be contributing to the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's disease. Now, his discovery was mostly ignored for decades, but your research is possibly vindicating his hypothesis. Could you please describe what you have done, what you've discovered?
Yes, of course. I study the role of herpes viruses in the development of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And my research is just the last bit of evidence from a long line of successful studies on this topic, actually. Although I agree, it has been a bit of a challenge for a long time since that first hypothesis. So what we did was we've been studying this association using epidemiological methods, meaning we've been observing the normal population without interfering in their health or lifestyle, just observing. We used a cohort for this of 1,000 participants here in Sweden, including persons aged 70 years. Most data was collected in 2001 to 2005, and then these people were followed for 15 years to see who developed dementia or not. And additionally, we used stored frozen blood to detect antibodies against herpes virus to determine who carried the virus and not. And then combining these two sets of data, we can look at this problem statistically to calculate the risk of developing dementia with herpes simplex virus carriage in a general population. And what we found was that this risk was doubled among people carrying the herpes simplex virus.
Doubled?
Yes, doubled.
That sounds pretty important.
It is, and it's actually in line with the research field as a whole. Uh, what I think is exciting about this research is that it's confirming previous results, and this kind of replicated evidence is important to make sure that our research findings aren't just a chance result. So we actually need to repeat studies several times before we can say fairly certain or with confidence that yes, then this is actually an association. Herpes simplex virus is a risk factor for dementia. However, in observational studies, we can't know if the association is causal or not. So we don't really know if herpes virus is causing the dementia. It might just be a coincidence. So for that, we need intervention studies.
Yes, indeed. And we haven't had any intervention studies of that sort yet, have we?
No, not to this date. We did a pilot study, actually, which I think is fairly exciting, on people with Alzheimer's disease carrying herpes simplex virus and a risk gene. And we gave them valacyclovir for 4 weeks to see if this kind of treatment was safe and tolerable and feasible in this population. Because they need to remember to take the medication 3 times daily, and that can be difficult when you have memory problems. But the trial was successful, so now we're just waiting for clinical trials to be completed, and I'm very excited for those results to come in.
Now, when you say successful, I think what you mean is people were able to take the valacyclovir for the 4 weeks of the trial, but you didn't actually see any improvement.
Well, the thing is, the main outcomes of the study was safety, feasibility, and tolerability. So we didn't have a placebo group, and that's why we can't really draw any conclusions from the other results. But we did collect data on things like cognitive performance, and we did see an improvement in cognitive performance among these trial participants. It's just that we don't know if they would have improved anyway, because you really need to compare those results with the placebo group.
You do need to compare those results with a placebo group, but I must say that it's really quite unusual for an Alzheimer patient to improve.
Right, yeah.
Even in 4 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am thinking, Dr. Vedung, that a lot of people may carry the herpes simplex virus in their bodies without even realizing it. And
Yeah,
can it, in fact, lie dormant for decades?
it can. At least it can it can go undetected for decades. There are a lot of people who are carrying this virus who are unaware that they have it. They may never have had any symptoms. However, it can reactivate asymptomatically. So it can reactivate sporadically without the person knowing it. So that's why I don't think we know if it lays dormant this whole time, or it's just that it reactivates without giving rise to any symptoms.
Now, when we talk about herpes simplex, we are talking about what people refer to as cold sores because it can manifest as a lesion on the lips, or genital herpes, HSV1 being the cold sores, HSV2 being the genital sores. And I'm wondering about other herpes viruses as well. I'm wondering, for example, about chickenpox that is caused by the varicella zoster. Is that possibly involved as well?
That is possible. There are indications from several different studies that other herpes viruses might be involved as well, including the chickenpox virus. But herpes simplex virus 1 has the most support. But it's very likely that when we talk about the etiology the causal mechanisms behind Alzheimer's disease and dementia, that it's complex. It's not just this one pathogen, or even it might not even be only pathogens. It could be other factors as well. So it's very likely that other viruses, other bacteria or fungi might contribute in some way, maybe in the same individual, or maybe in different individuals, different factors are important. And we just don't know at this point.
Dr. Vedung, you mentioned a clinical trial. Is there one underway?
Yeah, I think so. I think there might be a couple, although it's been a few years since they were started before the pandemic, I think. So I'm not sure what their level of activity is at the moment, but there have definitely been such efforts.
Dr. Vedun, another researcher at Harvard suggested that the amyloid theory of Alzheimer's disease might be a response to infection, that the amyloid plaque and the amyloid buildup is as a kind of a body's reaction to infection. And you've implied that it may not just be the herpes virus, that there may be other infectious agents or pathogens that are contributing to this brain deterioration that we call dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Is that a viable theory these days, more so after your research?
I do think so, yes. I am very familiar with Dr. Moyer's work. The late Dr. Moyer's work. He was a mentor of mine when I did a postdoc with his group, actually. So he proposed the amyloid protection hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, which I think is very viable, and it is consistent with my research, and it's also broadly consistent with the prevailing amyloid hypothesis. It just looks at the same thing from a different perspective.
Dr. Vedun, do you have any idea what might be going on in the brain? In other words, what's the mechanism of action of the virus? What's it doing in the brain, even if it's quote unquote dormant, that might be leading to pathology?
So herpes simplex virus usually lies dormant in the trigeminal ganglion. That's very close to the brain. Some might say it's part of the brain. It's a question of what definition you use. But I believe that it actually needs to enter brain to have any sort of effect on neural function. And we have very little idea about how this might actually happen. We can only guess. So if it was to reach the brain, it might not even be doing anything. It might be a mistake. It might have a hard time surviving, just laying dormant, biding its time, not really doing anything. We do know that herpes simplex virus can cause encephalitis, which is a horrible condition and very dangerous. But in the case of Alzheimer's disease, that did not happen. So if we're to speculate that herpes simplex virus contributes to Alzheimer's development by entering the brain, then I don't think it does anything in particular. I think it's the brain's own immune response that becomes dysregulated and pathological, and with time, over decades, causes Alzheimer's disease pathology.
Dr. Vedung, we think your research is really exciting. I'm wondering how your colleagues have received it.
I have very supportive colleagues. However, it seems to be outside of the current paradigm, and it's always difficult to embrace ideas outside of the paradigm. But I think we're gaining a lot of attention thanks to people like you who contribute to spreading the message. And I think things are looking better every year.
Could you tell us about future research plans, what you hope for in the next couple of years?
Well, I really hope for randomized controlled trials. It would be wonderful to finally get to know if there is a causal mechanism or not. And at the same time, we would see if the treatment is effective or not. So it would be a wonderful piece of news if that was to come.
And is there such research in the works?
Not by me. We have had difficulties obtaining funding for such large trials, but I believe others are working on it.
We certainly hope so. It seems as if, as you've pointed out, that the antiviral drugs like acyclovir or valacyclovir or famciclovir, they've been around for decades. They're extraordinarily inexpensive compared to modern-day Alzheimer's drugs that can cost tens of thousands of dollars a year, and they appear to be very safe. So we hope someone who's listening to us now will perhaps send you large buckets of money to do this research as soon as possible. It certainly deserves to be completed.
Dr. Bodil Vedung, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Bodil Vedung. She is an associated researcher in the Department of Public Health and Caring Sciences and Clinical Geriatrics at Uppsala University in Sweden. We spoke with Dr. Vedung from her office in Uppsala.
After the break, we'll talk with another scientist who's been considering the link between shingles and Alzheimer disease.
Because of an unusual shingles vaccination policy in Wales, our guest was able to find a causal connection.
The public health experts there inadvertently created a quasi-randomized scenario.
As a result, we can conclude that the shingles vaccine actually lowers the chance of getting dementia.
These results are remarkable. And new research suggests that the Shingrix vaccine is even more effective.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, backed by 20 years of scientific research and the maker of the most proven and concentrated flavanol extract in the market today, Coco Pro Cocoa Extract. Cocoa flavanols are among the most studied plant-based bioactives today and are clinically proven to promote cardiovascular and brain health for the long term, supporting a strong heart and better memory.
Get 15% off your order of any CocoVia product by using the discount code PPOD15. Learn more at CocoVia, and remember that discount code is PPOD15.
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory Plus is formulated with 750 milligrams of cocoa flavanols, a level clinically proven to improve 3 different types of memory and support brain function. More information at cocovia.com.
You just heard Dr. Bodil Vedung in Uppsala, Sweden, describe her research linking herpes simplex infections to a greater risk for dementia. That's part of a growing body of evidence that implicates viruses in neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer disease.
People suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID often complain about brain fog. We don't know if that will increase their risk for dementia later in life.
Recent research published in Nature Medicine suggests that the Shingrix shingles vaccine is associated with a significantly lower risk of dementia in the 6 years post-vaccination. A meta-analysis published in the journal Brain and Behavior last February concluded that every shingles vaccine may help protect people from developing dementia.
To find out more about this line of research, we turn to Dr. Pascal Gelsetzer. He's an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Primary Care and Population Health at Stanford University School of Medicine in Palo Alto, California. He's also affiliated with the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health, as well as the Department of Health Policy, King Center for Global Development, and the Stanford Centers for Population Health Sciences, Innovation in Global Health, and Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Pascal Gelsetzer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Gelsetzer, we have just spoken with Dr. Bodil Vedon in Sweden about her research regarding herpes simplex virus 1 that causes cold sores and its relationship to Alzheimer's disease, and the fact that it seems as if people who have HSV1 in their bodies may be at higher risk. And she alluded to the fact that it's possible an antiviral drug, such as valacyclovir, known by the brand name Valtrex, might be beneficial against Alzheimer's disease. And she is waiting for a randomized clinical trial and would actually like to do one herself with her colleagues in Sweden. You've approached this question from a slightly different perspective. Could you tell us a bit more about your research that was conducted, if I'm not mistaken, in Wales, in the UK, and it had to do with a shingles vaccination? What did you do? Why did you do it? And what were the results?
Yes, so we came on this really unique opportunity in the UK to look at the effect of shingles vaccination in what we think is a really clean causal study design, even though it's not a clinical trial, because what we're leveraging is this unique way in which the National Health Service in the UK rolled out the shingles vaccine. So specifically, they said on September 1st, 2013, when the program started, that those who haven't had the 80th birthday at the time of the start date of the program yet were eligible for 1 year, while if you had your 80th birthday just prior to that start date, you were ineligible and you remained ineligible for life. So this creates these groups just around this very specific date of birth eligibility threshold who differ in their age by just a minute degree, by just a week or so, but have this huge difference in their probability of ever getting the shingles vaccine. And so the beauty of this design is that we know that if we have a large group of people born 1 week and a large group of people born another week, there shouldn't really be anything different about these people. And so we can compare them and we can really ascribe any differences in health outcomes between these groups to that large difference in the probability of getting the shingles vaccine. And what we saw was just this really strong protective effect for new dementia diagnoses over a 7-year follow-up period. So specifically, those who we estimate that receiving the vaccine reduced the probability of a new dementia diagnosis by 20%. So for us, this was a really exciting finding and one that just remained there no matter which way we looked at our data, and one that we keep seeing now in other data sets as we're trying to replicate this in various different ways.
Now, a lot of times we hear about an association. Eating a high-fat diet is associated with heart attacks, or exercise is associated with a lower risk of heart attacks. But these are what we call associations, not necessarily cause and effect, because there can be many other variables. You're emphasizing that your research is likely to be causal. That is to say, it's not an association, it's probably cause and effect. Getting that original vaccine, I think it was called Zostavax, was surprisingly effective at both preventing Alzheimer's disease, and it also, if I'm not mistaken, you did some follow-up research. It was beneficial against dying from Alzheimer's disease. So can you just clarify again for people who are not familiar with these terms, causal versus association, why this research is so convincing?
Yes, so I think that's exactly the critical difference and why we're so excited about our line of research here. So in all these studies that have looked at vaccinations and infections in relation to dementia, you have to assume that those who go get vaccinated are similar to those who don't get vaccinated. And we know that that's not the case, right? Same with those who get infected are similar to those who don't get infected. We also know that's not the case, that they are similar. There are various different ways in which they behave, in their health characteristics, etc. And we are quite limited in the data that we have on individuals. For example, we don't know from electronic health record data what someone's physical activity is, right? And how long they exercise and to what intensity, etc. Even though we know that's a very important factor for your risk of dementia. So having to make this assumption that those who get vaccinated are similar to those who don't is often very implausible, I would argue. While if you have a setup where you have two groups of individuals who must be similar to each other because there's no plausible reason why they should be different, right? So we have people who are eligible versus who are ineligible for the vaccine just because of this difference in their date of birth, just because of this 1 week difference in age. That allows us to look at an effect without having to make this assumption that we've got perfect information on everyone and that we can somehow throw this into our analysis to make people comparable to each other.
And just to reinforce what you're saying, many researchers might say, well, people who seek out a vaccination, they are healthier than people who don't seek out a vaccination. In other words, these are people who may not smoke. These are people who may exercise. These are people who may eat healthier food, and they also are going to go and get vaccinated. So we really can't assume that those health seekers are identical to the people who don't get vaccination, whereas in your trial, it's just crystal clear.
Exactly. I think that is the crucial weakness of these associational studies, that we don't have this information, which we would really need to be able to fully adjust for the fact that vaccine recipients are different to vaccine non-recipients. But here, comparing people who are vaccine eligible versus those who are vaccine ineligible, because of this quite arbitrary date of birth eligibility rule, makes for a much more convincing case to say that you have a cause and effect rather than an association.
So to be clear, the people who were not quite 80 yet, as of a certain date when the vaccine rolled out, were able to get the vaccine. Those who were already 80 couldn't get it, and the ones who got vaccinated were less likely. How much less likely to be diagnosed with dementia?
So we saw a 20% reduction in new diagnoses of dementia over a 7-year period in our Wales-wide electronic health record data. And we've also used mortality data now in the UK to look at deaths due to dementia as an outcome. And we see a 10% reduction in deaths due to dementia over a 9-year follow-up period, using the same setup, same technique, same quasi-randomization approach. So yeah, those are some of our effect sizes.
Dr. Geldseltzer, I do want to ask you why this quasi-randomization is so important. Why does it matter that we have this unusual setup that kind of mimics a randomized trial?
I think it's critical, right? Because we have these observational data sources, and we are usually always in epidemiological studies assuming that those who receive the vaccine are similar to those who don't receive the vaccine, or those who get infected with HSV1 or whichever the pathogen is that we're interested in, versus those who don't, are similar to each other. And we just try to adjust for all sorts of variables that we have in these data sets, and hope that we have all required information to be able to say these groups are comparable to each other. But that is a really strong assumption. And we just know in most cases, we just don't have enough information in these electronic health record data sets on things like physical activity, for example, to be able to reasonably compare people. But if we have this quasi-randomization approach, where we have groups that ought to be similar to each other, because there's no plausible reason why they should be different, right? If I take a large group of people born one week and a large group of people born another week, why should they be any different from each other except for the small difference in age? Then we don't need to make this assumption that we have got perfect information and modeled perfectly all sorts of variables that could be different between these individuals. And that's what allows us to get at causal effects, just like in a clinical trial.
Right. Now, I think a lot of people don't understand, well, why did some people get the vaccine? And if I'm not mistaken, this was the Zostavax shingles vaccine, an early version of the shingles vaccine. And other people, didn't get. Why did some get it and other people didn't? It seems a little arbitrary.
Right. You will have to ask the National Health Service in the UK why they made this decision. It's certainly, I think, a mix of evidence and just available resources as well, that they decided to prioritize certain age groups. And so what they said is, if you're 79, you're eligible. If you're 70, you're eligible. And so, if you had your 80th birthday just prior to the start date of the program, you were missing out and you remained ineligible for life.
Dr. Geldsetzer, it seems to me that these results are extraordinary. I mean, as you said, causal. It's not just an association. It looks like the shingles vaccine prevented Alzheimer's disease in about, if I'm not mistaken, you said 20% of these folks who were vaccinated. That's so much better than anything else we've had for decades. All the Food and Drug Administration people and drug company people, they're all excited about anti-amyloid plaque drugs. Like, oh yeah, this is the great development. But they haven't shown any kind of prevention. They haven't shown any kind of improvement in Alzheimer's disease. They just slow the inevitable deterioration. Here you have something, a not that effective shingles vaccine. We now have a more effective one called Shingrix that actually prevented not just Alzheimer's disease, but death from Alzheimer's disease. Why aren't people jumping for joy?
We think they should. And that's why we're so excited about this research and really trying to build and replicate this in all sorts of different ways. And we're managing to see the same signal in other populations, other health systems. So that's something we're definitely pursuing. But it's an analysis technique and an approach that is fairly unusual in medical research. And I think very much the mindset still is that if it's not a clinical trial, then it's not causal. We don't think that's the case. I think there are clever ways in which you can make or design a study to get at causal effects in a much more convincing manner than standard associational studies. But having said this, of course, it does require a clinical trial, I think, at the end of the day, to really prove that there is no confounding. It's not a chance finding. And that's something that I hope would, is there in the future. And then I'm also trying to get people interested in and raising funds for, because these clinical trials are way more expensive than analyzing an electronic health record data set.
So, Dr. Geltzelter, you're looking at a causal connection. So we're assuming then that given the kinds of results you've gotten, that the virus, the herpes simplex virus, may be among the causes, obviously not the only cause, for Alzheimer's disease?
And in this case, varicella zoster.
Yeah, it may well be. That's certainly one very plausible hypothesis. The other one could be that it's a more of an indirect pathogen-independent immune mechanism that's triggered by the vaccine.
You're listening to Dr. Pascal Geltzelter. He's an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Primary Care and Population Health at Stanford University School of Medicine in Palo Alto, California. He's also affiliated with the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health, as well as the Department of Health Policy and the Stanford Centers for Population Health Sciences, Innovation in Global Health, and Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging.
After the break, we'll talk about the possibility that pathogens could be causing Alzheimer disease.
This idea has been floating around for nearly 40 years, but it hasn't gotten much traction up to now. Instead, researchers have been laser-focused on reducing amyloid plaques in the brain.
Unfortunately, the drugs that remove plaque don't seem to help people's brains work better. Why has the pathogen theory been overlooked for so long?
The study in Wales looked at Zostavax. There is a newer shingles vaccine called Shingrix. It's more effective at preventing shingles. Might it also work better to delay dementia?
We'll also learn about studies of other types of vaccinations. Do they show any promise against Alzheimer's disease?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The American healthcare system is one of the most innovative in the world, but it's also riddled with complex challenges like access to affordable medications and communication barriers.
There's a better way, and that's the name of a healthcare and technology podcast brought to you by SureScripts.
In this podcast, you'll hear from today's most inspiring and innovative leaders in healthcare, with in-depth and personal conversations on the industry's most pressing challenges and how we're navigating them.
There is indeed a better way in healthcare. Subscribe to the There's a Better Way podcast today on your favorite platform.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory and Focus is a unique formula made with a blend of ingredients that work together to promote attention and support long-term memory. It supports 5 areas of brain performance. More information is available at cocovia.com.
Billions of dollars have been invested in developing monoclonal antibody medications to remove amyloid plaque from the brain. The FDA recently approved one of these compounds called donanemab. This infusion will be sold under the brand name Kisunla. It doesn't prevent or reverse the cognitive decline characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, although it does delay the deterioration a little bit. Could a different approach offer a more cost-effective way to deal with this devastating disorder?
We're talking with Dr. Pascal Geltsetzer. He's an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Primary Care and Population Health at Stanford University School of Medicine in Palo Alto, California.
Dr. Pascal Geltsetzer, it seems to me that we'll call it the pathogenic theory of Alzheimer's disease, has been floating around for over 40 years. I remember Dr. Melvin Ball, a pathologist in the northwest part of the U.S., discovered that herpes simplex 1 virus might be involved in the pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease, and he was pretty much ignored. And other researchers over the last 30 or 40 years have also kind of suggested that there may be pathogens, viruses, bacteria, maybe some other pathogen that could be triggering a process that leads to dementia. And again, mostly ignored, where all of the neuroscientists' enthusiasm and money has seemingly gone, and we're talking billions and billions of dollars, has been in the amyloid theory of Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of drugs to lower amyloid levels have turned out to be either ineffective or just marginally effective. Why do you think the neuroscience community has kind of ignored for so many decades the pathogen theory of AD?
That's a great question. I think, it's something that you see pretty readily. These amyloid beta depositions, the tangles, etc., and it's quite striking if you see these depositions. So jumping on that or really believing that this must be involved must be the cause of dementia is very understandable, I think. And I do think there is this tendency in science to kind of group around a certain consensus and then defend that consensus, and not move into all sorts of different directions and explore different ways. And I think in this case, recognize that maybe this is involved in the causal pathway, but it may just be correlated with certain causes, right? Or it may be a result of a cause that's even coming before that, right? It's a step before that, which may be an infection, for example, or neuroinflammation from the varicella zoster virus reactivations, for example. But I think the frustration now increasingly in the field has opened up these possibilities and interest again to look at a wider range of potential causes.
Well, I think it would be interesting to explore the ways in which amyloid beta buildup could actually be related to an infectious origin. One of the hypotheses that we've heard and been interested in is that the brain produces amyloid beta as part of its immunologic response to an infection. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, no, this has been, I think, a major contribution to the field, and the evidence for that is quite convincing, I think. It certainly may well be the case that the amyloid beta is almost a bit like, the crust on a wound that you get if you have got some underlying injury, and this injury, it's sort of a mechanism by the body to try to repair something, and this could be repair of an infectious offense in the brain. That's, I think, very possible, and there is good evidence for that.
Now, I alluded to the fact that the Wales study that you have published showing that the vaccination for varicella zoster for shingles was quite effective in reducing the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or dying from Alzheimer's disease. But I said I think it was the Zostavax vaccine, which has now, I won't call it, has been replaced by, but now most people are aware of the Shingrix vaccine, which I believe is 90% effective. Is it possible that the newer vaccine would be even more effective than the one that was tested in Wales?
Absolutely, yes. So I think if the cause here is reactivations of the varicella zoster virus in the nervous system causing neuroinflammation, then we would expect that Shingrix would be even more effective in having a protective effect for the dementia disease process than Zostavax, because we know that Shingrix is much more efficacious at preventing these reactivations.
Is there any research plan to look at Shingrix to see if, in fact, it is more effective?
So it's very hard to do this in as clean a causal setup as we have had in the UK, because Shingrix wasn't rolled out using the same very specific date of birth eligibility rules. So we are able to look at this in associational studies, but not so much using this quasi-randomization approach, unfortunately. But I think it would be really exciting to look at this in a clinical trial. Same with Zostavax, also to look at this in a clinical trial if we think that this would be more due to an indirect immune mechanism from a life-attenuated vaccine, which is what Zostavax is.
Dr. Gelsetzer, it's not just a shingles vaccine that's of interest, because there are lots of vaccines. And unfortunately, vaccines are getting a bad name these days, but there's the BCG vaccine that has been used for almost 100 years and is now used quite a bit for treating cancer of the
bladder cancer.
Bladder cancer, but it's also been used, if I'm not mistaken, against...
Well, it's used in situations where children are at risk of getting tuberculosis. To prevent tuberculosis.
Exactly. But there's also the diphtheria vaccine, the polio vaccine, the flu vaccine. Do any of these other vaccines show any promise about reducing the risk for Alzheimer's disease?
Yes, so we certainly have these associations. There have been many associational studies that compared vaccine recipients with non-recipients. The issue here is that, again, you have to assume that those who get vaccinated are similar to those who don't get vaccinated. And you have enough information in your data sets to really adjust for all the different characteristics of these individuals. So I think it's much harder to say that these are causal associations as opposed to just correlations. And there haven't been any randomized trials, larger ones, to really look at the causal effect of any of these vaccines on Alzheimer's disease. But it's certainly possible. And these associations are pretty consistent and relatively strong in effect size as well.
Now, Dr. Vedon is looking at antiviral drugs, and in particular, she's been looking at valacyclovir, but there are a couple of others. There's acyclovir, there's famciclovir. And so it seems like there's this story that is evolving, suggesting that antiviral drugs or vaccinations might be beneficial. And I'm just wondering, why isn't the National Institutes of Health here in the U.S. and the National Health Service in the UK and other major health services around the world, why aren't they pouring hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this kind of research to find out, okay, if it is a virus, why not start studying antiviral drugs immediately and vaccinations? Why don't we really try and find something that works to prevent Alzheimer's disease? It seems like a no-brainer.
Right. I'm very much a proponent of this, and I am trying to raise funds for a randomized trial on this question as well, especially around the shingles vaccine. So if anyone's interested who's listening, they should get in touch. But I think the fact is that it's still a bit of a niche view in the Alzheimer's disease, dementia disease research field. And so I think it takes a bit of time to gain more traction and for people to really jump on board with this idea. But having said that, there's increasing recognition, increasing interest in this field. So I'm hopeful that this will be happening in the future. But of course, we are also competing with, many other researchers are pursuing other hypotheses, and they are trying to garner attention and interest into their research. And in fact, as much research is still pursuing this amyloid beta, the mainstay hypothesis, even though the benefits, I think, the fruits we have seen from this research have been fairly modest at best.
That was put very nicely. I wonder, Dr. Geldsatzer, if you would tell us what projects your group has already lined up. What are you working on in the near future?
Yes, so we are extremely excited about this line of research, and I'm throwing everything behind trying to dig further into this relationship between shingles vaccination and dementia. So we are working on replications of our findings in the UK in other health systems and other populations, using other outcomes as well that are measured in different ways. We are also hoping to gain traction around the idea of doing a randomized trial on this question, because I think that is really what will be needed to convince the medical community, the public health community, that this is a true effect. So these are the two main lines of research that I'm pursuing. And of course, there are various different offshoots. And as you start digging into one direction, you see so many other additional directions you can take. And it just goes from there.
I am a little puzzled why the manufacturer of Shingrix is not pouring hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into research to determine if, in fact, their vaccine is beneficial. I see commercials on television that are really scary. They basically demonstrate that, shingles is lurking. It's just waiting to emerge. You need to get your Shingrix vaccine now. And, yeah, well, that sounds like a good idea. I don't want to get shingles. That's very painful. It's a very difficult neurological condition, and sometimes it doesn't always go away. Well, presumably they're making a lot of money on their shingles vaccine. Why not fund a gigantic study with your group to determine if there's another benefit as an anti-Alzheimer's drug?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think it's a big decision for a company to take, right? Because this is a very expensive undertaking to do a clinical trial like this, and it would take quite a few years to have results. And there are always risks as well, right? I think here it seems very unlikely, but theoretically it's possible that you see some sort of harm in some kind of way. that will actually hurt your sales of the vaccine. So I think these are business decisions, and I think it will take a while for some of these companies to evaluate whether they really want to make such a big investment.
Dr. Pascal Geltsetzer, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
You've been listening to Dr. Pascal Geltsetzer. He's an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Primary Care and Population Health at Stanford University. He's also affiliated with the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health, as well as the Department of Health Policy, King Center for Global Development, and the Stanford Centers for Population Health Sciences, Innovation in Global Health, and Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging.
We spoke earlier with Dr. Bodil Vedong. She is an associated researcher in the Department of Public Health and Caring Sciences and Clinical Geriatrics at Uppsala University in Sweden. She told us about her research linking herpes infections with dementia. We have links to both Dr. Vedong's and Dr. Geltsetzer's studies in the show notes for today's interviews.
You'll also find an article on our website titled Shingles Vaccines Against Dementia and Flu Shots versus Heart Attacks. It describes the latest research in this rapidly evolving field. You might be surprised to learn how long this idea has been percolating, even though it's not part of the dominant paradigm.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Cardio Health is offered in both convenient capsule and powder formats, with each serving containing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols to support heart health. More information at cocovia.com.
Today's show is number 1394. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about today's interviews. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider and now on YouTube. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also get regular access to information about our weekly podcast, so you can find out ahead of time what topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.